or that the writers were mistaken, or that somebody was lying, or that something got miscommunicated. All I'll say is that for the naturalist, these conclusions seem a lot more plausible than the idea that a man might have risen from the dead. Having spent their entire life claiming to be openly searching for the existence of God as honestly as they can, and never have such an experience until the day they die, would you be committed to the view that they must be lying or mistaken, and that they weren't actually as honest as they claim to be?
So I don't rely...
Again, this is a little tricky because, of course, we're kind of... there's kind of a statement, then another statement, then a response to the first statement. I want to take a minute to just respond a little bit maybe to what was in Jonathan's opening. In 1790, Immanuel Kant somewhat famously said that there will never be a Newton of the blade of grass. Isaac Newton had recently described the motion of celestial bodies with unprecedented precision, and famously expressed it in a series of groundbreaking physical laws. Yet biological matter, like a blade of grass, or indeed a human being, was for Kant something that would be immune to future scientific explanation. Biological matter is infinitely more complex and more random and more infinite than any modern Newton could even wish to explain. Of course, less than a century later, Charles Darwin came along and appeared, and moved our understanding along quite considerably. Of course, he didn't even come close to answering every question of biology, but then Newton didn't come close to answering every question of physics. Still, our understanding developed. And what happened? Well, people immediately began to say, well, okay, look, maybe Darwin was something of a Newton of the origin of species, but we're still never going to get a Newton of the origin of life. In other words, the problem gets moved as our understanding increases. Now, granting for a moment Jonathan's claims about irreducible complexity of, say, DNA replication, we're simply left in a state of lack of understanding by positing that secular scientific investigation can, in principle, not adequately explain the existence and behaviors of proteins in DNA replication. Jonathan's argument, it seems to me, seems to amount to something like saying that there will never be a Newton of DNA replication. Now, I'm not a biologist, as should be clear. I will not pretend to adequately understand the majesty of our internal bodily functions, but I do know that since the beginning of modern science, it's been a common story for theists to claim that although certain scientific observations once thought to be inexplicable without God can and have in fact now been explained, but not this one. This one's different. This one is special. This one requires God to explain it. We've heard this kind of claim before, and what consistently happens? Just as William Paley once said this about the complexity of living organisms, and was subsequently answered by natural selection, Jonathan is now saying that DNA replication, or saying the same of DNA replication, the only difference being that he hasn't been answered yet. Of course, Jonathan is himself doubtful of Darwinian natural selection, I believe not thinking that we share a common ancestor with all the rest of life. Is that true? Yes, which is, if I may say, I think even more of an eccentric view among biologists than, say, the view that Jesus didn't existed or didn't die on the cross, or that the disciples lied, is among historians. Of course, those are very eccentric views, but I think that is more eccentric still. But even if he disagrees with this example I've just given, I hope that you will not, and that if you do as well, you can just think of another analogous scientific development to take its place. The history of irreducible complexity specifically is a bit of a patchy one. We've heard that it was coined by Michael Behe, who has offered himself numerous examples of irreducibly complex structures, some of which have actually been subsequently shown, it seems, to be, in fact, reducible. One example is the process of blood clotting cascades, which it was suggested by Behe to involve a number of factors which independently could serve no evolutionary purpose. In other words, all the parts are necessary and cannot be reduced. But one of the very factors cited by Behe himself, a plasma protein called factor 12, was later shown to be absent in whales, demonstrating that it is not in fact essential for blood clotting, and proving Behe wrong on at least this point. Indeed, even Behe's analogous example of a mousetrap has been shown on numerous occasions to be at least partly reducible. You can Google John MacDonald's demonstration of how, in principle, a mousetrap might work with only 4 parts rather than 5, and then 3, and then 2, and he even offers a suggestion of how a spring alone might be adapted to work as a mousetrap. Not a very good one, of course, but a mousetrap nonetheless. Now, Jonathan's example, as he said, is different, because DNA replication is the very basis of biological replication itself. I hope you're not expecting me to provide a biological hypothesis for it right now, because I cannot. But I must say that I'm left rather unconvinced that now, finally, we found something that is actually immune to future secular scientific explanation, even if it is immune to explanation by natural selection, which I'm not even sure whether it is or not. Consider the progress that we've made in our scientific understanding since Immanuel Kant claimed that we would never understand fully biological life. Of course, we're not even close to there yet, as it were, but we're constantly and demonstrably moving in that direction. Consider, by contrast, the progress that has been made by theology, not just since the time of Kant, but since the time of Jesus Christ himself, in explaining any of the problems that I raised in my opening statement. If there are elements of our universe without a sufficient scientific explanation, history informs us that we've been in this situation before and many times managed to overcome it. But the same is not true of my case. Where there are elements of our universe without a sufficient theological explanation, like suffering or hiddenness, history causes us instead to expect complete stagnancy. We have no analogous stories to the presentation and disproving of examples of irreducible complexity, or the progress of Newton to Einstein or Paley to Darwin. We're still today exactly where we started, with as much of an account for suffering and hiddenness than was available to Plato and the ancients. Put it this way, right? Answer honestly. If you were to look into a time machine and you saw somebody watching the video of this very discussion in the future, in about 100 years' time, let's say, would you be surprised to see one of them watching Jonathan's statement saying, would you believe it? They hadn't solved the problem of DNA replication yet. Seems at least plausible. It's easy enough to imagine, right? But it would be surprising indeed, don't you think, if you were to look into that time machine and they said, those same people were to say something like, of my case, would you believe it? They hadn't solved the problem of evil yet, or the problem of divine hiddenness. It seems infinitely less plausible. Intuitively, it feels like far more likely that the naturalist will one day be able to explain and account for DNA replication than that the theist will ever be able to account for suffering or hiddenness. Indeed, it's usually expected that the theist will never be able to offer such an account. Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only 3 explanations for the accounts of the resurrection, that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. I would add to this suggestion a 4th, which is that the reports themselves were inaccurately put down into our records, but I think Jonathan more or less addressed that by saying that the gospel writers were fairly scrupulous, and so I think implicitly trying to undermine that example. Now, I admit that some of the hypotheses for explaining what happened on Easter morning are a little bit tenuous. There have been theories that have been suggested and generally rejected by certainly most biblical scholars. For example, the idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen. These kinds of things are usually disproved with fairly intuitive points. That is to say, it seems ridiculous to suggest that Jesus didn't die on the cross. The Romans did know how to kill people, after all, and there would have been various other reasons, which I won't go into now for the sake of time, but I'm sure you're familiar with such a response. But you have to understand the context in which this conversation is taking place. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. But doesn't it seem less plausible yet to suggest that a man rose from the dead? To the naturalist, you can understand why this would seem like quite a leap, unless you've already assumed theism, making the suggestion that this God might have risen Jesus from the dead more plausible than these other explanations. Thinking about the evidence for the resurrection is a complicated topic, but it seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again. The earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ. What we do end, what the end of Mark's gospel does say is that, there's essentially a prediction. That is, we're told by an angel or presumed angel, that Jesus has gone ahead to Galilee, and you should expect to find him there. And this is where the original manuscript of Mark's gospel ends. Matthew, the next earliest gospel, does contain two appearances, one to the women who visited the tomb on the way to tell the disciples, and then a vision in line with the prediction made in Mark. Now, of course, if this was being somehow forged or something, it seems quite strange, or at least plausible, that this addition could have been made using Mark as a source, which everyone agrees that Matthew does. Luke, later still, contains even more appearances, including like the road to Emmaus. And then John's Gospel, even later still, provides more accounts of appearances, including doubting Thomas, and some other famous examples. I find it a little strange, then, that the further away we get from the origin of the source, the more appearances we see. The earliest Gospel contains no resurrection appearances. The second earliest Gospel does contain one group appearance, but it's exactly in line with what was predicted at the end of Mark. Anyway, this seems a little strange to me. Now, I won't suggest that I could confidently say that these Gospels were forged, or that the writers were mistaken, or that somebody was lying, or that something got miscommunicated. All I'll say is that for the naturalist, these conclusions seem a lot more plausible than the idea that a man might have risen from the dead. I think that's all I've got time for, but hopefully we can speak about St. Paul in a later stage. Thank you.
The resurrection claim falls apart when we look at the evidence. The earliest gospel, Mark, ends with an empty tomb, scared women, and no appearance of a risen Jesus. Mark 16:8 says they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The dramatic appearances come later in Matthew, Luke, and John. That looks like a story growing over time, not solid history. Science keeps correcting old religious claims. Christianity keeps asking us to believe the least likely explanation: a dead man came back to life.
Something like DNA replication, so we'll just plug in God, and as science progresses and advances, the argument has to shrink with each new development, and we are finding smaller and smaller gaps to plug God into. I disagree with this argument. I think that this is not a God of the gaps argument based on what we don't know about the cause and effect structure of the world. Rather, it's based on what we do know about the cause and effect structure of the world, namely that information-rich systems are habitually associated with conscious activity. In every other realm of experience, when we find information content, whether it's in the form of a hieroglyphic inscription or paragraphs in a book or computer programming script or whatever it happens to be, there's a habitual association between information content and intelligence. And so when we find information content in the DNA molecule, the discovery of that information content is rendered more likely on the supposition of theism than it would be on its falsehood. And so it tends to confirm the theistic hypothesis. It tends to confirm the design hypothesis. He says that science has had a track record of success in discovering natural explanations for natural phenomena and things that were, it's often said that we often find natural explanations for things that were once thought to be supernatural, but we don't have any examples of the contrary, where you have supernatural explanations explaining things that were once thought to be explained naturally. And I would want to challenge this argument by pointing out that there are modern discoveries in science which actually have increased the credibility of theism relative to what it was before. For example, in the 20th century, you have the Big Bang cosmology, which displaced the prior model, which was the steady state model, which maintained that the universe were essentially static and eternal. And that sits far more comfortably on a naturalistic scenario. In fact, the Big Bang in the 20th century was opposed by many for its profoundly theistic metaphysical implications. And yet the Big Bang enjoys strong scientific support and from multiple lines of evidence. And therefore, we have an example of evidence that has come to light in view of modern science that increases the credibility of theism, because the eternal universe sits far more comfortably on a naturalistic worldview, and so demonstrating the universe had a beginning raises the probability of theism relative to what it would have been otherwise. He says that my skepticism of evolution is more eccentric than Jesus' mythicism in historiography. I would beg to differ with this. I contend that there are. I think I could probably count the scholars with PhDs in relevant subjects who are Jesus mythicists on perhaps one hand. I can give you thousands upon thousands of critics of Darwinism and advocates of intelligent design. Read, for example, the Descent from Darwin list, which lists over 1,000 examples of scientists who are skeptical of the sufficiency of Darwinian mechanisms to account for the complexity of life. Okay, so he says that Behe was wrong about the factor involved in blood clotting that's absent in whales. So Miller actually doesn't refute Behe's argument. I'm afraid Alex is just misinformed here. So Ken Miller, who's from Brown University, I think he's now retired, he gave evidence that some vertebrates, like dolphins and jawed fish, lack certain components that are involved in the intrinsic pathway, that are found in land-dwelling vertebrates. And what he didn't acknowledge is that land-dwelling vertebrates and jawed fish and water-dwelling mammals, such as whales, dolphins, still have the extrinsic pathway intact, as well as everything after the point where the intrinsic and extrinsic pathways combine in land-dwelling vertebrates. So in other words, the jawed fish and dolphins still have the factors in the blood clotting cascade that were said by Behe in his book Darwin's Black Box to be irreducibly complex, which he said he was only addressing those after the fork, after the split. So they even have the factors on the blood clotting cascade's extrinsic pathway. The only factors that appear to be missing are the portions on the intrinsic pathway. And so since Behe's argument didn't include those factors on the intrinsic pathway, it only dealt with factors shared by jawed fish and water-dwelling mammals and land-dwelling vertebrates, Miller's argument, I'm afraid, doesn't refute Behe's argument. His objection doesn't refute Behe's argument at all. He says that so Alex said that, he said that we're more likely to solve the DNA replication problem than the suffering or hiddenness problem. I think that the more that we study the origins of life, and the more that we study the origins of these systems, the more intractable Darwinian naturalistic type explanations actually appear to be. The gaps, I would contend, are actually growing, not shrinking, when it comes to evolutionary explanations of these complex molecular machines. In terms of the resurrection, he says that there's a fourth alternative. The reports themselves were inaccurately given. I could talk for many hours on this subject, but I don't have time at this point. He says naturalistic explanations are almost more probable than the hypothesis of a miracle. The miracle has a very low intrinsic probability, and we need to assume theism first. Okay, I'm going to challenge my opponent this evening to demonstrate the low intrinsic probability of the special miracles that we find in the New Testament. And what's the basis, what's the justification for assuming them to be rare? If we say that it's because they noticeably deviate from the normal course of nature, that's exactly what you would expect on the supposition that God has used miracles as authenticating signs in history. And so the fact that they are, in fact, noticeably deviating from the normal course of nature can't be used as a defeater of miracles. And there's a lot more to say there, but my time is up, so I will conclude with that. Thank you.
Calling DNA information does not prove a mind wrote it. Snowflakes have patterns. Crystals have structure. Nature creates order without a designer all the time. Evolution is supported by genetics, fossils, and real observed changes in living things. A list of dissenting scientists does not overturn biology. The Big Bang also does not prove Christianity. It is a physics model, not a Bible verse. Religion keeps taking scientific discoveries and pretending they point to God after the fact. That is not evidence. That is rebranding ignorance.
Perfectly adequate evidence, and at one point even implied that for a lot of people, they won't be provided with adequate evidence at all, but rather in a sort of, on like a Molinist account, God will know what they would have done had they been provided with that evidence, and this is how we can explain that they're not damned. I found it confusing then that Jonathan went on to reference the Psalms in Romans 1, with the Psalms saying that the heavens and earth declare the glory of God immediately, and Romans 1 going as far as to say, it's something often quoted, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. the implication by Paul, at least, seems to be that actually people are without excuse upon investigation of the world around them in thinking that there isn't sufficient evidence for God's existence. It seems that the appeal there to Romans 1 and the assertion that God may not provide adequate evidence to everybody, and at least not overwhelming evidence to most people, even everybody, seem to contradict each other. It's possible that I've just misunderstood Jonathan there, though, of course, misunderstood. Jonathan also said that menial suffering can be explained by the uniformity of laws, which are a good thing. And I agree that these are a useful thing if you're designing a universe, to have uniform laws that keep working regardless of what happens. But of course, granting that these laws would require instances of menial suffering, which is already questionable for an omnipotent God, but let's just grant it, all this would require is my ability to sometimes stub my toe on a rock, because that's in accordance with the various laws and the location of physical objects. It would not require that I have the experience of being harmed by it. This is not something that would be required. Of course, on naturalism, suffering as a result of that kind of experience would be expected, because that's the very reason it evolved, is to help us to avoid such things, because it's a harmful experience. On a theistic paradigm, we might expect that God would give us a slightly more painless warning that we shouldn't be doing these kinds of things again. Jonathan also, I think, slightly misunderstood my point, forgivably though, because I made it rather briefly, which is when I said that science has made progress in explaining natural phenomena, and then I said that it hasn't made any progress, or even theology hasn't made any progress in addressing hiddenness and the problem of evil. I, of course, think that science has made much progress on certain points that might be thought to establish theism, such as the Big Bang. But my point was not that science has not made any progress on establishing theism, rather that whilst the things that I'm asking, the things that Jonathan is asking to be explained, including like DNA replication, we can expect from a historical analysis that one day my side of the camp, as it were, the people who think that everything in the universe can at least potentially be explained, will eventually do so. But on the exact reverse, which is something like hiddenness or the problem of evil being explained by Jonathan's side of the camp, that is the theologian, we should expect stagnancy. How much time do I have? 2.5 minutes. Okay. There are a few other little things that I would quibble on, but they're not exactly. They're not really sufficient to totally undermine Jonathan's case. For instance, it's often said that the fact that women discovered the empty tomb is evidence in the favour of the resurrection, because of course, why would any forgery have women discovering the empty tomb when their testimony is not worth very much? Of course, in not all of the accounts, but most of the accounts, one of the first things that the women do after discovering the empty tomb is run and tell the men, who are then reported to go and check, because they don't believe the women, so they then go and check and confirm that actually, yes, the tomb is in fact empty. So I think that this maybe isn't as strong as it's been suggested. Jonathan said that people are judged on the light that they have rejected, rather than some kind of, let's say, objective standard. He quoted Richard Dawkins in saying that even the second coming of Jesus would not change his mind. I think this just can be added to, shall we say, a cumulative case as to why Richard Dawkins shouldn't be taken seriously as a philosopher or theologian. I thought it might be worth just saying what I think might change my mind, which, if I didn't make it clear, I don't think that if I am going to become a Christian, it's most likely going to be through some form of syllogism. I don't expect, in other words, I think it would be quite strange for God to choose to reveal himself at the bottom of a microscope, that I kind of try everything I can, and then I read one book somewhere and see one syllogism, or look in a microscope and see one biological structure that makes me go, aha, I see him. I think it would be something like a religious experience, and the problem of divine hiddenness is why such an experience seems to have been not granted to me yet. But yeah, thanks.
Christianity wants it both ways. The Bible says God is obvious from creation, yet millions of honest people look at the same universe and see no clear God at all. That is a serious problem. A loving God would know exactly what evidence each person needs. Instead, religion blames the person for not believing. That is not justice. That is a rigged system. If God is all-powerful, clear communication should be easy. The silence makes far more sense if humans invented the claim.
Let's start by the resurrection, because I didn't really get to touch on that much in my last rebuttal. You mentioned that the earliest gospel doesn't have any resurrection appearances, and as you acknowledged,
Yes.
it says in Mark 16, the angels tell the disciples to go and tell, tells the woman, go tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told him. Told you. So there is a implication that there's going to be appearances. Also, 1 Corinthians 15, which is an earlier account, does mention more appearances than any of the Gospels.
500.
Yeah.
Of course, I've always found that quite strange, the reference by Paul there to the appearance to more than 500. This is, I believe, the only account of such an event happening. I wonder kind of who these 500 are, if they ever thought to write anything down, if there's any other account of 500 people having seen this kind of stuff. We're not sure why it is that Paul knows this is the case. He doesn't give an account of where he got this information. It seems to me at least plausibly something that could be false, right? It's not, in other words, it's not like extremely well established that Jesus did appear to a group of 500 people.
No, I agree with you. That I don't think the appearance of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15 is a strong evidential value. It's not a major line of argument for me. I'm just challenging your assertion that there's a developmental trajectory.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, which is fine, of course. You recognise that does exist within the Gospels. The only exception being here one reference by Paul in a letter, which, of course, we've got kind of no actual narration of the appearance. We've just got somebody saying that he's essentially heard that this is something that Jesus had done. Our earliest accounts of an actual narration of Jesus appearing to people don't exist in our earlier sources, except, of course, to the appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus, which would be an example of a group hallucination. But funnily enough, I find this quite interesting, is that it's often said that, well, the disciples couldn't have been essentially hallucinating because of the fact of group appearances. You don't get group hallucinations. But the only early account that we have of a group hallucination, that is the appearance to Paul and his travelling companions, is one in which the companions don't also see the appearance. It's just Paul. Which I find quite strange.
But
I'm dubious of
But
this.
they do have sensory perceptions of the encounter. But be that as it may, I did want to ask about, because coming back to your developmental scenario, Mark, we don't know what he would have gone on to say, because he finishes his account very abruptly. Scholars debate over whether Mark is completely intended to finish there, or whether he actually had an ending that subsequently got lost from verse 9 and following. So we don't really know what Mark would have said. And then Matthew and Luke are written approximately around the same time, and Luke doesn't seem to be literally dependent upon Matthew. So really your only data points are Matthew and Luke and John in terms of your developmental trajectory.
Sure, but of course the lack of the appearance narrative in Mark is part of that trajectory. Of course, this could be explained partly by that trajectory, or perhaps by the fact that he did write it and it got lost, or he just decided not to write it, of course. But I'm just kind of using the evidence that's being presented to me here, which are 4 Gospels, the first of which contains no resurrection appearances. And I'm thinking, what might explain the fact that as time goes on, the fancifulness of the stories seems to increase. Indeed, ending in John, the final edition, with the addition of doubting Thomas, which seems to be a moral lesson against requiring evidence for belief. Of course, after Thomas touches the wounds of Jesus, Jesus says, that it's, he now believes, but blessed are those who believe without seeing. He believes because he's seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. So what we get is the further away we get from the actual events that are being reported, the more fanciful the stories, culminating in a story that has a moral lesson advising people that they shouldn't desire to believe on the basis of evidence. This seems to me strange.
So that's not what John's saying there at all. In fact, in the very same chapter, he goes on to say, John, the author goes on to say that these things are written that you might believe that he is the Christ and thus have life in his name. In terms of what he says in verse 29 to Thomas, he's chiding Thomas for not having believed in sufficient evidence because he had the testimony of the other apostles. He'd been with Jesus throughout his ministry and observed the miracles and so forth.
Of course, John is writing at the end of John why he wrote his gospel, but I'm quoting the words of Jesus, right? So there's kind of there's a disanalogy here, or a difference here, which is that Jesus is saying, you believe because you've seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. It's then John who says, oh, but I decided to write this down so that people will come to believe. That it's kind of 2 separate sources there.
Sure. So, first of all, I gave an explanation for an interpretation of what I think Jesus is saying. And secondly, Jesus, if you look elsewhere, for example, in Matthew 11, when John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus, are we the one we're expecting, or should we wait for another? He says, well, go back to John, tell him what you hear and see. And talks about the miracles that he's been performing. Right? He talks about the sign of Jonah and his resurrection as being evidence for his incarnation and divine identity.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Is there like a question?
Yeah, so I'm objecting to that particular point that Jesus, Jesus does seem to affirm approaching this topic evidentially.
Oh, sure, yeah, okay, that would be fine. I'd be fine to just kind of drop that point about John, but I'm not really sure if we should.
Okay.
It seems to me that seems to be the most natural reading of Doubting Thomas. You're saying that the story should in fact be interpreted as Jesus basically saying, you have believed because you've seen a lot of evidence, blessed are those who believe having seen sufficient evidence, or something like this?
Yeah, so Thomas was discontent with having sufficient evidence, that he should have believed on the basis of what he already had. And God doesn't take well to people not believing when they've already got sufficient evidence.
Right, I see. That might be plausible. I'm happy to look into it.
I did want to ask you, though, about your low intrinsic probability of miracles.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So can you justify why you come to that conclusion?
I guess the point that I was kind of trying to make there was to say that in the context of this discussion, do you expect a naturalist to take as seriously the hypothesis that a man rose from the dead as he should take the hypothesis that, say, Jesus didn't die or something? Like, in other words, like, I suppose you're not surprised that somebody would not do that, but you're saying that they're being kind of, irrational in doing so?
Correct.
Because in assuming that something like a miracle would have a lower intrinsic probability?
Exactly. So I'm interested in what your justification is for assigning such an intrinsically low probability to miracles.
Wouldn't you say, like, as you said, the fact that this doesn't happen elsewhere would not be a good response because that's what we'd actually want. This is
that's what
God
we'd expect.
Is trying to do. He's trying to put forward a unique event. Could not the same be said that the reason why the resurrection is a powerful vindication of Jesus' message is because it has a low probability of occurring, and so that makes it miraculous that God did it, right? Like, it seems to me that the intuitive force of saying, isn't it amazing that Jesus rising from the dead, isn't it amazing that happened and this vindicates his message, is because of the fact that we should expect this to be so improbable that if it really did happen, this provides strong evidence. And I also wonder if you think that it would provide the same evidence as any other miracle. That is, I don't know why it is that rising from the dead specifically, except maybe the fact that he predicted it, would be any more of indication of his divinity than his ability to turn water into wine. If there was an instance of him having predicted that he would go on to do that and then did that, this seems equally miraculous. This is I don't see why the resurrection in particular would offer a vindication.
Sure. So for a number. Okay, so I'm trying to formulate a question. So Isaiah 53:10, for example, speaks about the resurrection in the context of messianic prophecy. Jesus himself says that the resurrection will be the vindication of his messianic divine self-claims. And so it's very surprising if God raises Jesus from the dead if he's a false Messiah, for example, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. Yeah. I think that answers it quite well, I think.
And would you also be amenable to the argument that you can bring other arguments to bear independently on Jesus' messianic and divine identity, such as some of the arguments I listed briefly, the trilemma, messianic prophecy, the conversion of Paul, etc., that would be relevant to establishing the prior probability in Jesus' case specifically?
The 500 witnesses claim sound strong until you ask for names, statements, or outside records. We do not get them. We get one religious writer saying a crowd saw something. That would not prove a miracle in any court or lab. Then John praises people who believe without seeing. That exposes the problem. Christianity demands a lower standard of proof for its own miracle claims than it would accept from any other religion. A claim this extreme needs real evidence, not anonymous crowds and faith pressure.
I think you could do, but I don't think that it's been very well done. I don't think the examples that you say, like the trilemma, I don't think that's like good evidence of Jesus' divinity, nor do I think the conversion of St. Paul is particularly strong evidence of Jesus' divinity. I wonder, I know there's only kind of a minute left of your time, but what are the specificities about Paul's conversion that you think bear on the divinity of Jesus?
Sure. I'm trying to formulate questions. So it's my question time, so I'm rather than give a statement.
Well, I can ask
sure.
you on the other time if you have anything else you want to say now.
Sure. Okay, so in terms of the argument for intelligent design, would you acknowledge that it's not a God of the gaps argument, that is actually a positive argument?
This is something I was going to ask you about. You said that it's not a God of the gaps argument because it's based on what we do know, and I forget exactly how you argued that case. If you could maybe just do it again briefly.
Yeah, so it's basically that there's a habitual association between information and conscious activity.
Right. Yeah, so I would say, for example, imagine somebody like pre-Newton or something, looking at the orbits of the planets and saying, like, I have absolutely no idea how they're up there, why they're spinning in the way that they're spinning. It must be God. Would you say that that is a God of the gaps argument? Mm-hmm. But suppose somebody then said to you, this isn't a God of the gaps argument. This is actually based on what I do know, not what I don't know, which is that there's a habitual association between things that we see moving, that don't stop moving, generally have some kind of agent causing them to continue moving. And so I say that the same thing must be true of the orbs moving in the sky. That doesn't seem to not make it a God of the gaps argument. That seems like just a way of kind of dressing it up.
Okay. All right, that's all we have time for on this section, so we'll flip the script, and Alex, you can go ahead and ask Dr. McClatchy.
Okay, I guess I can restate a question that I asked you directly in my opening statement, which is, are you troubled by the fact that a person's place of birth is a statistically reliable indicator of their likelihood of being saved?
Great question. So I with divine hiddenness, including the geographical predictability of religious belief, I trust the goodness of God that he will get the relevant information to people that need it. And if someone genuinely goes through their life and dies in a state of non-resistant non-belief, I trust in God's goodness and his mercy, and so I believe that he will give them some sort of opportunity. He will have some sort of arrangement worked out there. I'm familiar with also many examples of Muslims who have converted because Isa appeared to them in a dream. I know someone in my own circle of contacts that this happened to and converted to Christianity without any Christian background or much influence in that regard.
I wonder how you think this squares with something like Romans 1, which says that, which seems to imply at the very least, that God has provided sufficient evidence for everybody such that they are without excuse. In other words, do you think there is such thing as a non-resistant non-believer, truly? Or can be such a thing?
In regards to Romans 1, I actually think I don't see that as universally applicable, what's said in Romans 1. I see that as applied to a certain contingent of people.
So who would it be applied to? The Corinthians?
So he's referring to certain individuals to whom this applies. I don't think he's...
So you don't think that it applies to everybody?
Correct.
Okay, that's fine. That would sort out that problem. I also want to talk about God of the gaps, but we've already done that. Do you think that God has good reason not to overwhelm us with evidence of his existence? This is another thing that you were hinting at.
I do, actually. So, as I said in my opening statement, or in my rebuttal, I think that this life is a probation. We live in a moral choice arena where we mold and shape our character in engaging with each other and engaging in moral decision making. And if God were constantly at the forefront of our awareness, so that he was always right in front of us, right, then I think that would undermine the possibility of this life serving as a probation, because we would always be immediately conscious of God knowing our thoughts and knowing exactly what we were up to. Whereas if God strikes the right balance between hiddenness and providing sufficient evidence for those that seek him, he actually sets up the world, I think, in an optimal way so as to not go against our free will.
Yeah, I agree. This can be free will. I'd say is maybe a slightly different point. There are two things to pull out of this. The first is to say, okay, maybe God wants us to kind of be in a moral arena, making decisions about how to treat each other, and if he was constantly over our shoulder, as it were, it'd be like kind of your parents always being there, and that's the reason you're not stealing from the cookie jar. Right. Much rather you learn to not steal from the cookie jar, even when your parents kind of aren't looking over your shoulder. But of course, the child will have had at least one experience in their life that does overwhelmingly indicate that their parents exist. And that doesn't require that the parents be present in all of their lives at all of the time, constantly looking over everything that they do, only that at least once in their life they've been provided with such overwhelming evidence. In other words, I don't think you can make the same response to somebody who says, well, yeah, of course, I understand at the very least why it might be the case that God wouldn't want to constantly be right in front of our faces. That might interrupt some of our activities. But this doesn't seem to prevent him from providing one such example once in my life that allows me to know that he is in fact there, and then lets me live the rest of my life without his constant presence, engaging in a moral arena. I don't see why that would be a problem. Also, if you think that kind of maybe the directness of God would impinge upon our free will, not just, I wonder if you just mean kind of the free will to treat other people morally, or if you would include the free will to kind of come to love God, because I don't know if that's what you were kind of hinting at there.
No, I was talking about the making moral decisions in this life, because this life is a probation, and so and so this life is a test, and so God strikes this balance between providing sufficient evidence and also.
Okay, so then what about the objection that God could provide such overwhelming or even slightly more than adequate, let's say, evidence of his existence to everybody once in their lives, but seemingly fails to do so?
So I'm not convinced that there's such a thing as a long-term non-resistant non-believer. So if someone is a non-resistant non-believer at, say, time t, then it could well be the case that God's just not finished with them yet.
But I'm saying, do you think you're committed to this view? Because I'm saying that the problem is that God doesn't provide at least one example of his kind of overwhelming presence, just once, to allow a person to know that he's there, and then lives the rest of their life without his immediate presence. You seem to be responding to that by saying that the way to get around that objection is to suggest that if you haven't had that experience yet, you will do. So are you saying with like a bit more confidence that this is actually your response to that problem? You expect that someone like me who hasn't had such an experience, if I keep looking, will have that experience?
Right. As I said, I think that one of the forms that the probation in this life can take is to see whether one is willing to invest the time to conduct the sort of inquiry that will give one a fair assessment of the available evidence.
So given that then, if there is one example, do you think, in other words, there is no example of somebody who is a truly non-resistant non-believer for the entirety of their lives? In other words, if somebody were to die, having spent their entire life claiming to be openly searching for the existence of God as honestly as they can, and never has such an experience until the day they die, would you be committed to the view that they must be lying or mistaken and that they weren't actually as honest as they claim to be?
So I don't rule out that. So there can be examples, perhaps, say someone, for example, in an Amazonian tribesman, for example, who's never had access to the gospel or something like that. Then I think that God will judge them on the basis of the light that they've been given. And I trust in the goodness of God that he has some arrangement in place for such individuals.
I'm talking about people who are seeking God, have heard of the Gospels, are basically aware of the conversation that we're having, and they say, okay, well, maybe it's just because I need to keep honestly searching. They do that until the very day they die. They never have such an experience. Have they done something wrong?
No. So, as I said, I think if someone genuinely is a non-resistant non-believer throughout the course of their entire lives, I think that God will have some sort of arrangement.
Then it would be like the tribesman.
Yeah. But it's very difficult without, because the only person that I have complete biographical knowledge of is myself.
Quite right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know how God has been dealing in the lives of other people other than myself.
If Christianity were clearly true, belief would not look so much like a map. Born in Saudi Arabia, you are likely Muslim. Born in India, likely Hindu. Born in Alabama, likely Christian. That is not people freely discovering one obvious truth. That is culture training children before they can question it. Religion calls this faith, but the data looks like geography, family, and childhood conditioning. A fair God would not let salvation depend so heavily on birthplace.
Okay, 3 minutes. I'd like to talk about Paul, if we can. I tried to ask a moment ago what it is you think about the conversion of Paul specifically that bears on the divinity of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, very quickly then. So if we read the book of Acts, chapter 9, I would argue that Acts was written by a traveling companion of Paul, and I think that we can show with a high level of confidence that the account in Acts 9 concerning Paul's conversion actually most likely reflects Paul's
I'm willing
testimony.
to grant that.
Yeah. It seems to me that Paul is sincere in his conviction that Christ appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And that's clear from the way that Paul converts to Christianity against his own self-interest.
The first thing, okay, so there's the point about self-interest and there's the point about him appearing to Paul. Sometimes the conversation goes something like this. Somebody will say that, well, maybe the disciples were just lying. Yep. And one response to this is to say, well, this can't be the case because Jesus actually occurred to some people, which included his enemies, such as Paul. Right. But you recognize that the appearance to Paul is nothing like the kinds of appearances that are described at the ends of the Gospels. Sure. That is, it's not a physical Jesus, there's not a man who walks up to Paul, but rather just a bright light and a voice that he hears.
But notice that there is a sensory experience that it has upon his traveling companions. Yes. And also notice that he's blinded, he's healed by Ananias.
Yeah, there's an interesting study about that actually, in terms of like somebody having an epileptic fit and its ability to cause temporary blindness. It's actually remarkably similar to the experience of Paul. And of course the other his companions are said to have kind of heard what was said. It's possible that that was reported because, like, Paul might have just told them or something like this. It's at least plausible. They certainly didn't see the vision that Paul saw. Of course, there's also this point about the fact that Paul was a persecutor, so why would he suddenly sort of start believing in Jesus on the basis of this appearance? I think it's quite easy to say or to suggest that somebody who's engaged in the persecution of Christians would have something like a kind of guilt-driven appearance of Christ. I mean, you could make an analogy, for instance, to a lot of vegans will tell you that one of the reasons that maybe they went vegan, I've heard this a few times, is that they used to eat meat all the time, and they were watching factory farm footage, they just didn't really care, and then they had this dream where a cow appears to them and says, Jonathan, why are you persecuting me? And they say, why are you forcing me into a gas chamber? And then they wake up and they go, oh my gosh, and from that day onwards they become a vegan. Now I could say that, well, the fact that somebody just had this vision, and especially if they had it in the daytime and with a blinding flash of light and they thought it was kind of not a dream, in other words, I could say that their sudden conversion to veganism is best explained by the undeniable truth of veganism. Or I could say that it's because they were feeling guilty about what they've just done. And if Paul has just overseen the stoning of, who is it? The stoning of Stephen, thank you. The stoning of Stephen, he's watched this take place. He goes on a long walk with lots of time to think to himself. Don't you think it's not too surprising that he might have something like an experience driven by guilt? And that would explain why a persecutor becomes a Christian, not the truth of Christianity.
Short response,
okay.
Yes.
Briefly, so yeah, that's a possibility, but is it probable? So, for example, Paul describes in Philippians 3:4-6, he says, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness, under the law, blameless. He seems quite content in his former ways of Judaism. Also, in regards to guilt-based conversion. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders says that women are 5 to 1 times more likely to experience conversion psychosis. Also, adolescents, military persons in battle, people of low economic status, and those with a low IQ are also more likely prone to experience this phenomenon, and Paul doesn't seem to fit that reference class.
Thank you. That's all we have time for. Sorry.
Cool.
All right. So I'd just like to take a moment to thank both of you for a really engaging discussion and your civility and kindness toward each other. I really appreciate it. So we're going to take some time now to open the floor for questions. I think the format, we will take 3 in-house questions. Yes, go ahead. We'll take 3 in-house questions first. So for those of you on YouTube joining us live, you're welcome to submit questions starting now, and I will start with the first, whatever we have time for. So we'll take 3 in-house questions, and then I'll go every other if we have more in-house between YouTube Live and the in-house questions. So for those of you who are here in person, you can make your way to the microphone and ask a question. Just form a line, and you may direct it to either speaker. Yeah.
But can I just say, by the way, that I'm filming questions for uploading the debate to the YouTube channel, but if anybody wishes not to be in it, just come and let me know.
Go ahead, and there's a mic set up there. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Alex, for your openness about your search for God. I really liked how you shared that. Now, I have 2 questions, very close, similar to one another. So, on divine hiddenness, is that lack of religious experience or lack of convincing arguments, all the arguments that Jonathan gives? Would you define the divine hiddenness as lack of religious experience or lack of arguments? And for yourself, you spoke of your own search for God. Was that the lack of convincing arguments, or was that lack of religious experience for you?
Yeah, thank you. That's a useful question. I think it may be both. As I said, I would imagine that if there were going to be something that would be able to convince me, even if just based on my what I've heard from conversion stories, it doesn't tend to be that somebody hears a new argument and then kind of drops to their knees and accepts Christianity. But you hear of overwhelming religious experiences, a bit like St. Paul's, which do that. In fact, almost all of the gospel accounts of people coming to sort of follow Christ is generally based on some form of experience. They see a miracle performed, Paul sees a blinding light, this kind of thing. There might be a message in there, in fact, that the Christian should expect to be convinced to follow Christ, not by argumentation, but rather by the things that they experience. So I would predict that that would be the case. Although I do also think that it is strange, suspicious, that I find what has been described as like an avalanche of evidence as simply unconvincing, and in such a way that I think I can at least explain why I think that, even if I'm mistaken. There's a kind of question that can be asked if somebody says, someone like Jonathan says, look, here's a piece of evidence, here's another piece of evidence, here's another piece of evidence, and why are you not a Christian? Why are you not convinced by this? To which I would say, good question. That itself seems to be a potential objection taking the form of divine hiddenness, which is that we have the same evidence on the table in front of us, and yet I guess I'm just made of such a psychological constitution that for whatever reason, even if I'm honestly mistaken, I don't find it convincing. But Jonathan does. Lucky him, I guess. Now he gets to inherit eternal glory, and I don't. In other words, it doesn't seem to be my fault. So I think that kind of not being convinced after an honest engagement with various arguments is a good basis for the divine hiddenness problem. But in my own personal experience, I would predict that it's probably the lack of experience that most motivates me to be suspicious of the existence of God.
So do you think a religious experience would help you see the arguments differently?
Now, there's a really interesting question. In fact, Jonathan and I were talking about this a little bit last night, although in reverse, which is like, is it the case that if I were to have a religious experience and then I re-evaluated the arguments, would I find them more convincing? Well, that may be true, actually. I'd be surprised if that weren't the case. But to me, that just shows God surely would know that people are more likely to be convinced by a particular line of reasoning if they haven't experienced. And so kind of being lambasted for not accepting the convincingness of an argument, if that's maybe because of the fact that I haven't had the kind of experience that would make me take it seriously, that just makes it worse, I think, because then you can ask, well, isn't it even more unfair that I've been restricted such an experience that it's even going to affect the way that I engage in conversations like this? So if that were the case, then great, I hope such an experience will come my way, but I'd see it in itself as a problem.
Paul's conversion does not prove Jesus was God. It proves one man had a powerful experience and changed his life. People change religions, politics, and beliefs after visions, guilt, trauma, dreams, or seizures. That does not make the vision true. Even Acts cannot keep the details clean about what Paul's companions heard or saw. Christianity builds a huge claim on one man's private experience, then calls it evidence. That is weak. A changed life is psychology, not proof of a resurrection.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Just actually, I'm going to make one comment before you ask your question. Sure. I saw a comment in the YouTube chat asking if we are taking YouTube questions, and yes, we are taking YouTube live questions. I will allow 3 audience in-person questions first, and then I'll get to your questions. So just hang tight.
Great. All right, my question is for you, Alex. I think when it comes to the biological argument, to go from a single cell to a complex human through unguided evolution is unlikely, but I grant that it's plausible. But to go from nothing at all to a single-celled argument seems even, a single-celled organism seems even less likely to me, even more amazing. So I'm curious what you think just about the origin of life itself as regards to a naturalist explanation.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of the most kind of amusing questions in the world. Of course, I think Jonathan would agree that if we were to say something like, well, we are just bemused at how this came about, it was probably God, that this would constitute a God of the gaps argument. There might be a way that, again, you could dress it up as to say that it's kind of more something, as Jonathan says, about what we do know, that this kind of thing doesn't happen. But the amazing thing about the origin of life is that it seems at least to only have happened once. That the fact that it only happened once and kind of doesn't happen all the time might be an example of such an argument that's not a God of the gaps variety that says that there might have been some divine intervention here, because if it happens naturally, why doesn't it happen all the time? Of course, this might equally be explained by the fact that it seems our most recent evidence suggests that life began almost immediately after the Earth formed around 4.5 billion years ago, at least in its most simple form. So maybe it had something to do with the original conditions of the Earth that don't admit now. But of course, I have no idea how life got started in the universe. And I admit that in terms of those considerations, that when you just kind of think of them in the kind of context of a theistic discussion and think, yeah, right, that does seem like a pretty good reason to think that God exists. I don't think it can be formed into an argument that isn't fallacious, but I understand the intuitive appeal. I don't know how life began in this universe, but I just put it into the box of those things which are yet to be explained. There are lots of incredible things that are yet to be explained, like the development of consciousness, for example. But yeah, I guess I don't see them as this is like a good reason to consider God's existence unless it can be put into a good argumentative form, you know?
Gotcha. Okay. Can I ask another question?
I'll go for it. Feel free to get in line so that we can see. I'll give a little bit of leeway if it doesn't seem like we're building up questions, but feel free to get in line if you have one so that we get to your question.
So I thought it was a really interesting argument to say that Paul's conversion might have been kind of a guilt-based conversion, and that kind of explains why he left his lifestyle of being a very high-status person to being persecuted. What do you think of just the other apostles, though, who didn't seem to have any guilt-based reason to follow Jesus and still gave up a lot? Even though they didn't really come from any prestigious background, they still chose to enter a life of persecution and suffering for Jesus. Why do you believe that they did this?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and it's actually something I haven't really heard kind of put in those terms before, in terms of like not so much the disciples being willing to suffer for their beliefs, but the beginning of them following Jesus. It seems clear to me that, for instance, if it's the case that Jesus didn't actually perform any miracles, he wasn't divine, it still seems possible that he would have managed to get some people to follow him through being an extraordinarily charismatic teacher, as I think everybody would agree that he was, atheist or not. In other words, I think there are some quite plausible explanations as to why people might have followed Jesus. As you say, they didn't have like a whole lot to give up. Although I guess it's enough that it should cause a problem, right? To kind of leave your job, leave your wife, follow this man, this kind of thing. I do think that is a problem that needs to be explained. But again, if you're asking me, not already assuming the existence of a God, not assuming like the viability of the resurrection or something, here's an account of some men who heard a man, claimed to see him perform some miracles, and then decided to follow him. I don't think that the best explanation of this is going to be that God exists. Of course, as part of a cumulative case, it's a useful thing to bring up. And as I say, it is qualitatively different from Paul. But yeah, no, it's interesting. I guess I'd have to give it more thought. But I guess intuitively I would say that they're originally following Jesus isn't too difficult to explain by Jesus being a charismatic, natural human being, and only human being. Their willingness to suffer and die is, I think, a separate question, which is harder to explain, but that, I think, would lend itself more to the other hypotheses that have been suggested. For instance, like, there are only 2 deaths of disciples, if I'm not mistaken, recorded in the Gospels themselves, which are the killing of James by Herod with the sword and the suicide of Judas. We have some extra-biblical evidence of the other apostles being killed. I think it's believed that sort of every apostle's death is accounted for somewhere, but there's not a whole lot of detail about the nature of exactly why they were killed and how they were killed. For instance, it's not obvious that they would have been saved if they recanted. It's possible that they were being persecuted because of what they'd done and what they'd said, and so that even if they then were sort of cowering in their knees, asking to live a life as a non-Christian, they might have been denied it. There are interesting responses to that. For instance, the Romans' ability to use someone as an example. If they said, no, Christianity isn't true, don't kill me, then maybe they would have had reason not to kill them. But at the very least, it's a fuzzy issue. I think there are a lot of things that need to be considered. I just don't think that without already assuming the existence of a God, it makes sense to best conclude from these facts that Jesus was his divine son.
Great, thank you.
So this question is pointed towards Dr. McClatchy. So you mentioned, obviously it wasn't like one of the core arguments, but you mentioned that the existence of Israel as a nation, the continued existence of Israel, is evidence for theism. And I'd wondered why it is that the existence requires theism. Like, obviously I think there's other explanations that would give a legitimate explanation to why it exists. I can understand a little bit the argument of Israel up to the point of Jesus' birth, but you mentioned also the Holocaust and the continued existence. And I wondered how the continued existence requires theism.
Right, it doesn't, is the short answer. So I don't think that would be sufficient evidence to conclude that the God of Israel exists, but it does move the needle in that direction, because when we're trying to conceive of what is evidence, we want to really assess a likelihood ratio. What's the probability of that evidence existing given the hypothesis being true versus the probability of that evidence existing given the hypothesis is false? And so if to say that X counts as evidence for Y, what we're really saying is that the probability of that evidence existing is greater given the hypothesis than given its falsity. So when it comes to the survival of the Jewish people and nation of Israel against all odds, that's something that's highly expected on the hypothesis that the God of Israel as revealed in Scripture exists. But it's not particularly well expected on its falsity, especially when you look at all the ordeals that the nation of Israel has been through. You've got the Assyrian invasion under Sennacherib during the days of Hezekiah. You've got the Babylonian exile in the 6th century, and the Persian conquest, and Haman, which is written of in the book of Esther, and his plot to exterminate the Jews. You've got Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC, who was kind of the ancient equivalent of Adolf Hitler, who wanted to abolish the Jewish customs and the Jewish religious practices and so forth. And you've got the siege of Jerusalem, and you've got the Nazi Holocaust and so forth. And in spite of all of those trials, the nation of Israel has survived against all odds, which is not sufficient to conclude that the God of Israel exists, but it is evidence that moves the needle in that direction. Does that answer your question?
Religion keeps treating mystery like evidence. We do not fully know how life began, but we do not know yet is honest. God did it explains nothing. People also follow charismatic leaders all the time, even when it costs them. That does not make the leader divine. And the survival of Israel does not prove Christianity. Many nations, cultures, and religions survive terrible history. Survival is not a miracle claim. Christianity keeps stacking weak points together and calling it a case. Weak evidence does not become strong just because there is a lot of it. So here is the real question. When religion points to mystery, suffering, visions, geography, and Old Testimony, is that enough to prove God? Or is it just humans trying to explain what they do not understand yet? Comment your thoughts below. Like and subscribe for more, and if you want the full breakdown, make sure to watch part 1 of this debate series.